Great. So today we are here with Georgia Brookes, who runs all of the campaigns at Freestak. And we are going to tackle a really fascinating and important subject. We're going to talk about ambassadors, content creators and influencers working longer term with brands. And I think to start off with, we should probably define what is an ambassador versus what is an influencer.
Excellent start. Well, first of all, hi, and thanks for having me, Simon. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into this topic, and it is an important place to start because I think that we forget that ambassador programs have actually been around for a lot longer than influencer marketing. Athletes are pro athletes in the context of the endurance sports sector where we work. They're brand ambassadors. Celebrities going back 100 years would wear certain products from brands and they would be brand ambassadors. So although influencer marketing in its current form of social media is relatively new, ambassador programs have been around for a while. And in some ways, the same mantras still sit. We'll get into kind of more detail on that later, I know. But to come back to your original question and how they differ, personally from experience, both ambassadors and influencers are authentic content creators. They're people who've already built up a loyal following through engaging content on social media, something, in a particular topic that they're really passionate about. But the difference in running an ambassador program and an influencer program, I think comes down to kind of one main area, which is testing product or advocating for product. So influencers are testing, they're working on short-term relationships with brands. You may be an influencer and an ambassador, and with one brand you're an influencer and another you're an ambassador because you have an advocacy and a long-term relationship with that brand. But they won't be competing products. So an influencer, for example, might test 5 different pairs of running trainers from 5 different brands. However, an ambassador for a running brand would be loyal to that one brand and only run in those trainers. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense. And I can see the benefits of both. So if we take this from the point of view of the brands rather than the point of view of the content creators, which maybe we'll get onto in due course. But if you take it from the point of view of the brands, what are the benefits of working with these influencers who are maybe working with multiple brands versus the benefits of working with an ambassador?
So if you're working with influencers, every time you work with someone new, you're reaching their audience, and that's a new audience for your brand. If you're only working with ambassadors and you have the same ambassadors for a year, 2 years, you're constantly hitting the same target audience. Of course, their audiences are growing on their own channels, but you're not reaching masses of new people. With influencers, if you're working with lots of different influencers on different campaigns, you're reaching a massive audience. I think secondly, if you work with influencers, you can get more varied content. When you work with influencers or ambassadors, something that is so unique to the industry is that you're working with creatives. You don't give them a brief that says exactly what the photo should look like. Well,
you shouldn't be.
You shouldn't be. And this is something, we could talk about at length, but it's not the subject for now.
Today, yeah.
But they're creative. And that's one of the amazing things about working with them. And if you work with influencers, working with new people always, you're getting these different angles of their different types of creativity and really varied content. Having said that, I think some of the disadvantages are quite obvious, such as not having that loyalty from an influencer. And for example, if you are testing a product, you're perfectly within your right to say something negative about the brand if you have a bad experience. So definitely some pros, definitely some cons, and the same for ambassadors. It's the flip side. You get loyalty and advocacy from ambassadors. They know your product, they know your brand. So they're experts, and they'll share that expertise with their audience. On the flip side, they're talking to the same audience.
Yeah.
So,
is there a sense then that, one thing that you just mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is that an ambassador becomes an expert in your brand. Is it the case that quite often, because an influencer won't necessarily invest the time in really understanding the full brand story because they're only going to have a relationship with them for a relatively short period of time, whereas an ambassador is really kind of going to get under the skin of the brand and have more kind of expertise. And I guess then it becomes a question of what you're trying to achieve, right? So if you're just trying to achieve the biggest possible reach, then maybe working with lots of different influencers is key. Whereas if actually what you're trying to do is get across some quite complicated or nuanced stories, then ambassadors kind of have a bigger part to play.
Definitely. And I think that both influencers and ambassadors are storytellers, but the depth at which they can connect with the brand story definitely depends on the depth of the relationship. And if it's a one-off campaign, of course, there might be a lot of time for briefing, for spending time with the influencer. However, if they are then just going to move on to another brand, how is that story being told consistently to their audiences? An ambassador, on the other hand, if they're working with them on that long-term relationship, that story is not just a one-off campaign. It's the journey of the ambassador and the brand together. And that's what they can really communicate so well through their content.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me just as we were talking about this is back when we first started Freestak 7 years ago, which feels like prehistory in this sector, one of the things that we used to talk to brands about a lot was how they would populate their own social channels with really engaging content. And I don't think that problem has gone away, by the way. And I think, if anything, that problem's got worse for brands, because if you're not posting regularly, you're not getting any sort of cut through. And it's interesting because I would say that one of the advantages of ambassadors is potentially that you have this always-on source. Like, we've talked about the maths, haven't we? If you've got 50 content creators and they're producing 2 pieces of content a week, you've got 100 pieces of content a week that you can reuse, which feels to me like a really powerful tool, a great way for you to build your own social channels. Whereas perhaps with an influencer, what we might call a seeding campaign, you're going to see a real spike, a big output of content in a relatively short amount of time, but it's not going to have the longevity. It's not going to last because those people will move on to other campaigns.
Yeah, there are kind of 2 things that I'd pick up on what you just said there. And the first is a caveat that just because someone is your ambassador doesn't mean that you own their content. And it's important that it is therefore in the agreement with the ambassadors. And this is a topic that we talk about a lot at Freestak and get questions on, is the agreement between ambassadors and brands. And if you are going to repurpose their content, which I personally think is an excellent use of an ambassador program. And if you're giving ambassadors the correct rewards, then of course, write it into the agreement that you can reuse their content. However, just because they are a brand ambassador does not mean that you own their content.
Yeah, that's a good point.
To come back to your original point about the quantity of content, absolutely. We see time and time again ambassadors just going above and beyond because they're in a true relationship with these brands. They have a mutually beneficial relationship. So they see the advantage of talking about them. They genuinely are passionate about sharing. Just one example of an ambassador program that we've run with 361 Degrees. Their ambassadors on average produce 300 pieces of content a month, and they've only got 40 ambassadors. So these guys are talking a lot about the brand. Conversely, when they run an influencer seeding campaign, we see about half the amount of content from the same number of content creators. So if you're looking for consistent, high-quality content to populate your feeds with, first of all, get it in the agreement. But yeah, get this ambassador program going.
Yeah. I mean, just to kind of flip the subject a little bit, because obviously, we are an intermediary, I suppose, between brands and the content creators who are part of the Freestak community. What do the content creators think about this? I mean, are they big fans? Do they like these ambassador programs, or would they prefer to be like free agents running around working with whoever they want?
So one of the advantages of working with a community like Freestak is that we get to talk to these content creators every day. We have a relationship with them as well as the brand having relationships with them. So when we've asked them, we can do surveys, we can chat to them. And one survey when we asked about whether they prefer ambassador or one-off influencer campaigns, 84% said they prefer these long-term relationships. Now, that's not to say that 84% of the time ambassador relationships are the way to go, but our community do seem to prefer having these long-term relationships with brands. And a couple of them have said a few things about the way that they have these relationships. And the words that keep coming up again are family, commitment, team. And those are money can't buy words that brands want associated with them. And these guys are giving it freely because they have such a good relationship with the brand.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because I think, in another recording that we've done recently, we talked a bit about how you reward content creators and influencers and ambassadors. And the point was made that potentially we're starting to reach product saturation. Like, there are people out there who've got a big following, they're creating great content, i.e. they're very attractive to brands, and they just don't need another pair of shoes. So it's interesting that I think that it feels as though maybe underlying that kind of desire to have a longer term relationship with a brand is just like, I just don't need dozens and dozens of pairs of shoes. What I'm more interested in is what you said, family, team, being part of something. So I think that's really, it's a really interesting part of that. So yeah, if I sit here now as a brand marketeer and I'm like, okay, I'm convinced, I think that an ambassador program is the way to go. How do I grow and scale it? What are the kind of key things that I need to be thinking about or doing that are going to help me to get it off the ground and then sustain it?
I think, first of all, you got to start with finding the right people. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but a lot of people, brands we found, get excited by this concept of ambassador programs. They've seen one of their competitors do it, and they jump on and they want to do the same thing without thinking about who the right person is. When you do your marketing plan, your Gantt chart, all this kind of thing, and you think about your target customers, you often do a customer persona. And I would really recommend doing the same thing for your ambassadors. Do an ambassador persona. Think about your brand why. Is that their why? Your brand ethos. Is that the influencer's ethos? Your goals, do they align with these ambassador goals? And that's what you want to have in your ambassador program. So if you're going to scale it and you're thinking about how big can we get this, you don't just want to throw out numbers for the sake of numbers. You want the right people in your ambassador program.
And we see quite a lot, don't we, that brands will say, well, I've got some ambassadors. And when you ask them where those ambassadors came from, it's just like random serendipitous connections, or because, as we've just said, a lot of content creators are really keen to get into these relationships. They're asking brands, can I become a brand ambassador? And because I suppose in the best possible way you could describe that as organic growth of an ambassador program. But it does, sometimes you tend to find that there's quite a jarring kind of mismatch there with people that haven't been selected for the right reasons. They've just been selected because they wear the product, or they happen to kind of sit next to the marketing director on a flight somewhere and just browbeat them into letting them become an ambassador for the brand.
And vice versa, sometimes we've seen one instance where we were helping a brand reorganize our ambassador program, and they asked us to reach out to the people who were their current ambassadors, and some of the people we reached out to were like, no, I'm not an ambassador for this brand. So these long-term relationships need to be maintained properly and chosen correctly, rather than chosen 3 years ago, abandoned, or choosing any Tom, Dick and Harry who will wear their shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about the team, so often, I think generally we would say to a brand, one person is not an ambassador. Like, one person can be an ambassador, but it's not going to have the kind of impact. I mean, how do you advise a brand then on the makeup of a team? Because I think that's important, right? You've got to get the right people individually, but then you've got to create the right collective. So what should brands be thinking about when they're trying to build a team?
I mean, again, 361 is a great example of this, because their team do refer to each other as a family. And one of the main reasons for this is that 361 invest in doing international meetups. So these ambassadors get to know each other. And then when they're doing races in each other's cities, they host each other. When they're traveling, they go on holiday together. They love sharing content with each other. They've created a true family. And that's because 361 have facilitated them actually coming together and, yes, checking the makeup of the team, making sure they have a good balance of men and women, of different speeds, of all the different makeups of their brand. And that kind of comes on to the second part of the makeup idea. Who is your target customer, and are they reflected in your ambassador program? There are many, unfortunately, in the sports industry that have been criticized for having the token fat person, the token black person, who is being the representative in an ambassador program of white males with the perfect running position. And if that's not your brand, then don't do that. Why would you do that?
Which, I mean, and I think this speaks strongly to why brands can and should be working with content creators who are, inverted commas, kind of normal people, versus just purely working with elite athletes. Because I would argue that whilst it's amazing that brands have athletes who are standing on the top step of the podium at races, most of their customers aren't those people. They're not running, a shade over 2 hours for the marathon. They're not sort of hammering around 10K in 29 minutes. So, elite athletes bring you headlines, but they're not very relatable. So I think, to your point, brands should think about how they can make their ambassador programs relatable to the customer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch Mo Farah and think, do you know what? I need his trainers because that's how I'm going to run a 2:08 marathon. I watch, a 30-year-old who works really hard in central London and has all the kind of same problems that I do. And I think, actually, I want to know what they're doing. What are they doing to spend more time getting fit and active? They're the person that I look up to. Of course, Mo Farah is great, but he's not someone that I can relate to. And your ambassador program needs to be populated with people that your target customers can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Going back slightly, because I think that was an interesting divergence, but going back slightly to, when you're scaling your program, like a lot of the programs we work on have got dozens of participants in that ambassador program. And you just mentioned that sometimes we've had the situation where a brand has claimed that somebody is an ambassador, and when we approach that person, they say, no, I'm not an ambassador at all. So there needs to be an agreement in place. I mean, sometimes refer to it as contracts.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't refer to it as a contract unless you have legal advice.
Actually, a contract.
And exactly. I think you're getting yourself into muddy waters if you go around claiming that you're in a contract with someone and there's no legal. I mean, I don't even know the words. There's no legal ramifications because it's not a contract. So an agreement is the term that we use. And although we have had legal advice on our agreements that we use at Freestak, we still would call it an agreement because it's a partnership. You're both entering into it kind of willingly, and you both want to give back willingly. So it's an agreement.
And that's a really nice idea. I think if you go in with that mindset of this is a partnership, we've got an agreement, it kind of creates the tram lines within which we're going to operate, but it isn't restrictive. It isn't like, pinning down to sort of finite detail.
But still necessary, I think. In an ideal world, people are like, well, I don't need an agreement because my ambassadors are so invested, they know exactly what I want. But actually, when we've talked to our community, the 3 things that they want the most from an ambassador program are commitment, sincerity, and communication. And I think the agreement really falls into both commitment and communication here. They know what the brand are giving them and they know what the brand want from them.
Yeah.
And that makes the whole process so much clearer.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, if you were trying to draft one of these agreements, where do you kind of like, where do you get the sort of the basis for that agreement from?
So there are lots of sources out there that can be super helpful when you're deciding what should go in this agreement. There's kind of legal services online that can help you with a template agreement. Also, the ASA will give you advice on disclosure, which is super helpful and important that you cover your own back as a brand and make sure that you've given the agreements. But first and foremost, ask the influencers. They are the guys that know their stuff. They're the ones in relationships with brands. They know what's reasonable to ask and what's reasonable to offer. Ask advice. That's what they're there for. You're in a partnership.
Yeah.
And so What do they want from their agreement? What do they want out of this relationship? And what do they think is appropriate to get in return?
Let's say, for argument's sake, we've decided that we're going to have an ambassador program.
Great.
My brand marketeer hat on. And we've thought about the makeup and the kind of people that we want in it. And we've sort of started kind of drafting. We've got an agreement. Maybe we've got different agreements for each member, although that might not be very scalable. But we have an agreement in place. What do we do when things go bad? Because these part of the beauty of content creators and ambassadors and influencers is that they're people. So they do have opinions. They do sometimes go a bit off the rails. So what do we do when things kind of start to go a bit south?
Yeah, so unfortunately, obviously, with any human relationship, sometimes these things do happen. However, we've noticed a pattern, you could say, of 3 areas, really, that I can identify where things can go wrong. And the first is alignment. And this comes back, Simon, to what we were talking about earlier. When you think about the brand why and the ambassador's why, the brand's ethos, the ambassador's ethos, the brand's goals and the ambassador's goals. If those align, then you're getting your relationship off to a good start. And that is the preventative measure for things going bad. If you're aligned, you're off to a good start. The second area that we sometimes see these ambassador programs going wrong is when brands lose control of their ambassador programs. I mean, that sounds a bit abstract, but what I mean in the specific case is that the ambassador program becomes diluted because everyone and anyone is jumping on a hashtag, a name, a title. And this is often down to what we were saying earlier about communication. If you, for example, have a global office, then you have regional offices, then you have local offices. There are so many people involved in your business and in your ambassador programs. You might have hundreds and hundreds of ambassadors. Are they all getting the same consistent message? Or are the people in the UK getting a different one to the US? And suddenly the program becomes diluted. It loses its meaning because one person is saying one thing about being an ambassador and what that means, and then another person saying another. Or, for example, are your PR agency naming anyone who they seed a pair of shoes your ambassadors?
Well, we've seen that with distributors, haven't we? Where you get a distributor network, and they're creating their own kind of team, ambassador teams, and then one team is receiving bags and bags and bags full of kit, and everyone else is wondering why they're not receiving the same. And the reality is it's because they potentially don't understand that actually there's a distributor in one country who's prepared to give away a lot more stuff than the distributor that looks after the territory that they're in. But that control thing, I think, is important because it allows everyone to understand the rules of the game, and then when they know the rules of the game, they're all happy to play, right? There's they don't start to feel as though they're disenfranchised or or they're not being treated fairly or something like that.
I mean, influencers are still your consumer, and so to influencers and consumer, if Brian in the US is getting 20 pairs of trainers and Bryony in the UK is getting 2, they don't know that the US and the UK are actually 2 separate companies just under the same name. To them, it's one brand, and that's not fair. And what they're experiencing as ambassadors are completely different. So then you're also going to lose control of the messaging. I think we've slightly deterred from the original question. But my final thing that I do see is what you spoke about, Simon, which is it's human relationship. There's miscommunication, there's misunderstanding, there's life. There's actually, I'm closing down all my social media channels because something's happened to me in my life. And in this case, we have to remember that influencers and ambassadors are human. Pick up the phone, talk to them. I always recommend using a tool to manage these programs, but that doesn't mean that there always has to be a computer in between your relationship with the individual.
Yeah, I think that, one of the benefits of a tool like a platform that allows you to manage your ambassador programs is that when you need to send out mass messages, mass communications, you can do that super easily. But you're right, when there's something exceptional going on, we're involved in endurance sports. Whether you're a runner, an adventurer, a cyclist, injury happens. And how many times do we see this where somebody suddenly goes a bit quiet and we're wondering what's going on? We give them a quick call on behalf of the client and they say, I fell off my bike or I've hurt my knee or I've had an accident or whatever.
Send them a card.
Yeah, send them a card, exactly. Send them a card and figure out a way of getting them back into the program in a way that feels authentic, right? I mean, we've seen this many times with brands where they say, well, this person's injured, but actually the story of them coming back from injury is great content, and the rest of the team rallies around them, and you get this sort of amazing upswell of kind of really authentic content because these people care about each other. Absolutely. Yeah. So use the platform, but also use the phone is the message.
And nicely summarized.
Thanks. So one of my favorite phrases is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. What if brands are considering starting an ambassador program, or maybe they've got one, but it's just not really firing? When is the right time to do it? What are the things that they should consider before they get started, or in fact before they ramp something up?
I think, you said it so well in your nice little platitude, which you do love. But to start, in terms of timing, I think you got to look internally first. So you got to think, do we have the time and resources to create an ambassador program? I'll keep coming back to this: commitment, sincerity, and communication. Do we have the time to commit to creating an authentic ambassador program? Are we sincere about this? And do we have the time to communicate effectively with them? So devise your ambassador persona, understand who you want to work with and what the flavor of your ambassador family will feel like first. Then when you've got that, start testing the waters. Don't dive straight in and be like, this is what we know because we planned it in our offices, is the type of person we want to work with. You wouldn't do that in any other marketing channel. You'd do an A/B split test. You'd put a few different things out there. Do the same with influencers. Run a seeding campaign with 100 influencers that you're somewhere in the persona that you created. Some are slightly outside, some are totally left field. And actually, you might be surprised what you find. And that's where you can start to develop the ambassador program. Don't go out and suddenly announce that 50 people, because you saw them once on Instagram, are your ambassadors.
Yeah.
Take the time to think about it, but get cracking, because it's worth investing the time in it.
And I think, again, as a tactic, it's really interesting what you've just said. If you pick 100 people, seed some product to them, you might find your first 20 ambassadors from that group, right?
Exactly.
But that's actually a tactic that you can then replicate. You could do that annually or biannually. You could say, every 6 months I'm going to run a seeding campaign and pick 5 or 6 people that do a fantastic job for me and sort of almost promote them or invite them to become part of your ambassador program. So you can kind of grow your ambassador program and therefore your audience, but do it in a way that sort of minimizes the risk.
Yeah, we do this with a lot of our clients and find it to be super effective because it really incentivizes influencers to create more content, to go above and beyond the brief that they've been given, because they want to have that relationship with the brand. So every time you have a new product release or a new campaign running, run an influencer campaign alongside your ambassador campaign, and you might be surprised at the number of high quality influencers who you can integrate into your ambassador program.
Yeah. One thing that we see a lot at the moment is that good content creators, good influencers, people that are creating great content, have got a really engaged and active audience of a significant number of people, are more and more in demand, and that they're being snapped up. There are certain kind of programs out there that can remain nameless that are sort of sweeping the board,
dominating the field.
Yeah, sweeping the board, and so I echo exactly what you say, which is that there's no time like the present to get started, because the longer you wait, the more the people that you potentially want to engage with and have on your ambassador program are being kind of persuaded to advocate for another brand. And once they are, because of the nature of being an ambassador, they're off the table for a year or whatever the term of that ambassador program is. So yeah, I agree with you. I think now is the time. But
just on that, I think that if you think of an influencer in some ways like a business, and they're starting at zero, like a business starts at zero. You got to start somewhere. And if you are a small business, all this talk of ambassador programs, investing time, investing money might seem really overwhelming. We don't have the resources for this. Start small and start with micro influencers and grow together. Those big ambassadors, those big influencers, the kind of high numbers, they've been snapped up. But that doesn't mean that, that there aren't ones out there that are up and coming in the same way that your business is up and coming. So grow together, work with people with 2, 5, 10,000 followers that are really finding their voice, and support them, and they'll be forever loyal because you supported their voice when they had no voice.
I think that is an absolutely perfect point to wrap it up. I think, ambassadors is a fascinating area. I get the feeling that the future is going to be more about ambassador programs and less about one-off influencer campaigns, although they play a part potentially in helping brands to create ambassador teams. But I think it's just a really exciting area, and I'm looking forward to exploring it more and perhaps kind of recording something more like this in a few months when things have developed further.
Yeah, let's see where it goes.
But thank you very much for your time. That was great. Excited, and we'll see where we go with ambassador programs.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Georgia.